Hi there, I'm Bernard Keane. Welcome to a special budget edition of Crikey's Crossing the Floor. In just a few short minutes, the Crikey team and myself are about to go into the budget lockup, and this year, as with last year, we are joined by one of Australia's foremost economists, Professor John Quiggin. John, thanks for joining us in the lockup again this year, or when we're getting there. Just before we talk about the budget specifically, where is Australia at the moment in terms of the overall environment? Clearly, the economy has performed much more strongly than anticipated, but there are issues around the mining boom, around skill shortages, and then there's the complex international environment, not merely with Europe, as we've seen in the last couple of days, but there's some question marks over China as well on the long-term stability of that. What's the overall economic context in which the government has framed this budget?
Well, of course, as you said, the issues that were exercised about before the crisis, things like the mining boom, sacking labour out of other areas of the economy, skill shortages and so forth, are back again to some extent, which is an indication of how strongly and surprisingly we've recovered, bearing in mind that unemployment is still near 10% in most of the developed countries. So, on the one hand, if you just look domestically, we'll be back having had a brief interruption to a boom that was seen in 2007 as being overheated. But on the other hand, all the issues you mentioned are present as threats on the international front, and more generally I think the likelihood of a continuing unstable macro environment for quite some time to come appears unavoidable. We don't know how the European situation will work out. Ahead of that, certainly the Chinese boom has to slow down at some point, hopefully in a controlled fashion, but we can't tell. So the long period of apparent stability that we had enjoyed in Australia, at least for 15 years or so, I don't think that environment is going to return anytime soon.
A lot of speculation this year, given this is not a big spend-a-thon of a budget, I guess has been around how quickly the government can return to surplus. There's a lot of talk about the path back to surplus, which until now has been conceived of more in terms of numbers of years, getting us well into next decade. The speculation now is a much more rapid return to surplus. How quickly or can they plausibly do it? And secondarily, return to surplus has something of the status of motherhood. Are there any risks associated with a determined rush back to surplus?
Well, so in the budget and also in the mid-year outlook, they had a projection of 2015-16 for the return to surplus. That's clearly is far too pessimistic now. And I think it's safe to predict that the budget will be in surplus by 2012-13. The interesting question is whether they could manage it, pull a rabbit out of the hat, as budgets traditionally have, and get back to surplus by 2011-12. That would be quite a challenge, and certainly there would be a bunch of political and as well as economic risks. Obviously, they need some more nasties. Of course, they've already, with the backflips a couple of weeks ago, they only make sense if they're going to have some very good news on the surplus front. And then the question is, well, is 2012-13 good enough news? Looking at the economic issues, I think on the whole, and especially looking at the recent developments in Europe, the risks of taking it slowly on the way back to surplus are probably greater than the risks of moving back rapidly, and that reflects the fact that it seems likely that we're going to have further shocks, likely that we're going to need another big round of fiscal stimulus sometime in the future. We can only afford that fiscal stimulus if we run surpluses in times of relative prosperity.
Sure. Let's talk for a moment about the government's recent tax reforms. Now, you, I think as people will see in Crikey today, you support the government's resource super profits tax. Is there any substance to this industry claim, which is continually being peddled out? It's got more impetus today with the Peabody-MacArthur deal, that the tax is going to discourage investment or put projects at risk?
Well, if the tax worked ideally as designed, it would have no effect on investment, and that would be, of course, a marvellous outcome. No tax works perfectly, so I expect at the margin there will be some impact, but that's in the context, of course, of a mining sector, as we've just said, that is expanding incredibly strongly. All taxes have adverse effects, and certainly to the extent that we put a little bit more on the mining sector and a little bit less on business in general, I can't see that being too problematic. But if we look at the Peabody deal, they downvalued MacArthur from $4 billion to $3.8 billion. That doesn't sound like a catastrophic reduction, and certainly that's in the context of something which already has well-established assets. A more marginal enterprise will be less subject to the super profits tax and therefore less likely to be downvalued. Finally, I think it just has to be said the mining sector has been playing this game for decades, whether it's the ETS, native title, union rights, any of a range of environmental issues. Every time something comes up, they threaten to pick up their bat and ball and go home. They never have, for the simple reason that the minerals are underground, they can't take them with them.
One of the big claims the opposition's been pushing for most of the last 12 months, in fact, if anything a little bit longer, is that the government has been forcing up interest rates through overstimulating the economy or failing to withdraw its stimulus measures rapidly enough. Given we're looking now at, I guess, a tight budget with a much quicker return to surplus, is that going to play out in the way the opposition's been anticipating? Is it going to discourage the RBA from further rate rises, or is the RBA in its current tightening phase driven by other concerns than the issue of surplus and deficit?
Yeah, I think this is very depressing to see this come all the time from the opposition. It's very clear that the Reserve Bank has made it very clear that low interest rates are an emergency measure, certainly the kind of very low rates we had at the depths of the crisis, that their aim is to return interest rates to what they consider the normal range as soon as the economy recovers. So the extent that the opposition's claim has any substance at all, it's saying we should delay economic recovery in order to hold interest rates down. Well, yeah, that's great for populism, but it certainly doesn't say much for the opposition as economic managers. Certainly I think their difficulty is going to be if there's a rapid return to surplus, especially if that's financed to some extent by tax measures they're not willing to match, this line of rhetoric may rebound on them.
John and I will be emerging from the lockup several hours hence, and we'll be committing another talk to film in light of what we've managed to discover. So all will be revealed in a few hours' time.